Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for the September edition of ECGrid Presents, a monthly webinar series where B2B industry experts share insights on various topics of interest for our supply chain community. My name is Linda Moore, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Chad Alessi, who'll be sharing his expertise on managing cybersecurity and keeping data safe across the supply chain. Chad's currently the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Practice at CTG, so I encourage you to take this opportunity to ask him questions by typing them right in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen anytime during his presentation. As usual, you'll all receive a link to the on-demand recording of this session by email. Welcome, Chad. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Great to see everyone, and thanks for everyone for coming and attending the webinar. This should be fun, it should be interactive, and it should be something that hopefully at the end of this, you guys will take away some interesting, at least thought-provoking ideas, as well as some maybe actions to help secure and protect your supply chain. So the topic of discussion today is cybersecurity in supply chain, and we put in EDI because you can't talk about supply chain without EDI. Every company today relies on their supply chain. That can be a positive and a negative, particularly when we talk about securing your supply chain. And at the heart of those supply chains sits EDI, so we have to talk about EDI as well. And that is the invisible digital plumbing that moves all of our purchase orders, our invoicing, and our shipping notices. And it allows us to quietly do the work that we need to do. But unfortunately, if one link in that chain breaks, it causes a complete shutdown and a business continuity event in our abilities to be able to process and transact in our supply chain. So what I wanted to do today was walk you guys through a journey of supply chain risk, talk about some potential pain, and then talk about some painful lessons that we've learned through managing the supply chain, and then hopefully get some actionable recommendations to helping you get back into a safer position and a stronger, resilient cybersecurity and also cyber resilient supply chain. So why supply chain is part of the attack solution or the attack surface? So why is it such a big deal and such an issue that we're talking about it today? Well, one of the reasons why obviously is because it's had some pretty high profile attacks and disruptions in business, but it's truly a really important thing. So EDI and supply chains transactions power billions of dollars every day, as you guys know. If they stop, then business stops. So no shipments, no invoicing, no payments. That's why cybersecurity and supply chain isn't just about protecting data. It's about protecting the revenue, the operations, and even the trust that we have with our supply chain vendors. So protecting data isn't enough. Protecting trust requires a cyber resilient supply chain and really that supply chain orchestration. So it's the business critical impacts that we look at. How does this supply chain have the potential to impact our business if it is in fact attacked? And then how do we recover? How do we respond and recover to those attacks to ensure that we continue to build trust with our clients and our customers, but then also building trust within our supply chains as we start to manage those third-party risks that we'll talk about here shortly. So your supply chain becomes your attack vector. We've talked about this quite a bit. The supply chain becomes a problem when you have third-party connections. It is a strength in the fact that we can have those third-party connections, allowing us to have a connected supply chain, but it also opens up a wider attack surface as we get into the conversations around the attack surface and looking at managing our own internal resources around our security. We also, now that we're connected to all of these trading partners, we now have to worry about their internal business processes and how they're dealing with things. So third-party dependencies increase your exposure to cyber threats. While it's a positive on one hand, it becomes a negative on the fact that now you've opened yourself up for greater risk. Common attack vectors include vendor remote access. This is something that we see regularly where we allow a vendor to have remote access because it's required for them to be able to do work in our systems, but that opens us up to that vulnerability. And if they are compromised, then we've actually allowed an attacker a backdoor into our own systems. We also see a lot of software tampering through updates. So not updating your systems and patch management all obviously become a big security risk, but then there's also software tampering. Then there's insider and misuse within partner organizations. That becomes a big problem as you try to work through these, and it really affects trust and issues that you may have with your third-party vendors. Some of the things that we've seen as best practices is obviously implementing robust IAM practices around that third-party access, and then examples of really trying to make sure that we're regularly assessing and monitoring that supply chain. So you'll see a recurring theme throughout the presentation today as we talk through those things and really try to address the risks that we've identified in our supply chain as we work through those. So the EDI risk that you must address. So these are EDI risks that all organizations face, but it's around how do you actually protect it and what is going to be the process of going about doing that. So EDI was originally built for efficiency, much like a lot of the OT systems that we work on. They weren't designed for security inherently. They were designed for efficiency. So being able to exchange data, exchange information in an efficient manner to be able to streamline and improve business outcomes is really the ultimate goal of EDI when we built it and designed it in the beginning. It relied on legacy FTP connections. So some of those FTPs are still in use today. Messages can be spoofed or altered in transit. There are weak partner credentials, making identity theft easy. So this legacy system continues to be a problem. And then weak partner credentials makes identity theft easy. And through that actually opens up yourself to greater attack vectors and attack weaknesses in your overall supply chain. So unmonitored EDI gateways become a weakness. So when in the past, we weren't necessarily worried about monitoring those EDI gateways, we were really worried about making sure that they were up and running and that they were active. But the traffic across those gateways weren't necessarily something that we were monitoring on an active basis. So we now have turned and started to look at those regularly so that we can isolate those and understand what traffic is going across there, what weaknesses we may have, and then making sure that you've got some encrypted protocols as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And these are not just theoretical risks, they're happening every day. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the breaches in the past and some examples that most of everyone should be aware of, but it's good to rehash and talk about those so that we can learn from those previous and past experiences. So what's changing? There's lots of changing in the industry today. The threats keep evolving. Ransomware has already paralyzed logistics companies. IoT and OT devices are expanding the attack surface constantly. We talked a little bit about the OT not being inherently safe, as well as EDI. Blockchain continues, and distributed ledger brings in new complexities. So we have to deal with new complexities around that. How do we deal with those distributed ledgers in a safe and secure manner? And attackers are now using AI to probe and exploit weaknesses, and that's done at a machine speed. So we're having to keep up with these AI exploits with our human-based analysts to ensure that we're not only keeping up with those attacks, but keeping up with the emerging threats as they continue to change. And we're seeing changes happen really quickly, as opposed to taking years to develop the attacks and exploits. As soon as a exploit has been published, there is a exploit. As soon as a vulnerability has been exploited, and an exploit has already been developed for it pretty much on the heels of it right after it becomes public. So we're having to keep up with those at lightning speed. And those become a bigger issue. Ransomware still is high on the list of activities that are continuing to disrupt the supply chain. So what are the lessons from some of the real world activities that have happened in breaking the supply chain? So Target breach was one it's an oldie but a goodie, as we call it. It's one of those that really disrupted the overall supply chain of Target and its ability to receive and make payments. Over 40 million credit card records were exposed. The retail supplier essentially was crippled for a short period of time until they were able to get those back up and running and recover. Um, Maersk was one of the largest public supply chain ransomware attacks that got hit. It disrupted the global supply chain and shipments and operations, caused losses estimated of 3 million across all of their operations, and they continue to see issues and problems with that. And then it would be remiss for me not to mention Change Health and the impact that Change Health had. The ransomware attack, and this was Change Health got attacked based on credential management, and it actually really highlights the risk of our connected supply chains nowadays. But that ransomware attack disrupted operations and stole up to 6 terabytes of data. The data included personal information, payment details, even insurance records, and other sensitive information. It actually even led to a ransomware payment of $22 million. Some of that has not been confirmed, but it is still a large number. So it is not covered under insurance and those things. So a lot of these impacts to the risk of the business is not only the outage, but also the recovery and response is also having to be foot by the actual business themselves, which turns into a big business continuity crisis as we start to look at this. When we think about our ability to identify, protect, and detect in making sure that we're doing the right things in our daily operations to protect the business. But then the business continuity crisis comes in that response and recover after an actual attack happens. And so these are all examples of it's not if, but when. And then when are you, when it happens to you, are you set up for that cyber resiliency to actually respond and recover to those events as they're coming at you real time? So how do we harden our environments, and how do we, particularly looking at our EDI? So the EDI essentials, we look at this, as I mentioned, for identity, protect, and detect. So we look at identifying our assets. So we can't protect what we know, what we don't know, we don't have. So it's in an effort to really understand what vulnerabilities we have within our systems. So we need to map out those vendors and EDI dependencies to really gain a full visibility of our supply chain and the connections. In each one of those connections, like I mentioned before, it becomes a potential risk point. So we need to look at those to make sure that we're incorporating into our overall risk and vulnerability management. We need to look at the mapping our vendors and our EDI dependencies. So we need to extend our vulnerability management programs, not just in configuration management and scanning and looking for open vulnerabilities that may be published and then patching those. But we really need to look at the mapping of those vendors within our supply chain and getting a full picture, full visibility of our supply chain as a whole. We preach and talk about protecting our communication, not only at rest, but also in transit. So using encrypted transport protocols. This is something that we continue to see organizations using legacy protocol that is not encrypted and or legacy protocol that's not supported anymore, like TLS 1.0 and others. So making sure that you've got that encrypted transport layer incorporated into your overall vendor communications, and making sure that vendors are using encrypted communication protocol as well. Implementing strong identity and access management. We briefly touched on this a second ago, but it is one that we still see a huge weakness in a lot of our supply chains. So thinking about regular credential rotations, making sure that you have multi-factor authentication incorporated, making sure that you've got even your API keys are scoped inside of your identity and access management program and how you're going to deal with those. And then we've got the new emerging non-human account issues that we're going to start seeing here in the market as we continue to emerge into agentic AI. And how do you really manage that non-human account and working through those accounts regularly and rotating those credentials? And who is the owner of those accounts and who's responsible for making sure that those are secured on a regular basis? Also looking at hardening your EDI gateways. This becomes a big thing as well. So making sure that you're applying strict security controls. We want to look at making sure that we're doing continuous logging and monitoring of those gateways. And then real-time alerting. So that allows us to respond in real time to those events as they start to see behavior that could potentially be an indicator of compromise. We want to continue to monitor those on a regular basis. So we continue to look at this as a holistic program, and we really want to take the basics of the identify, so understanding what our actual risks are, then putting in controls and protection around that, and then we want to make sure that we can detect if there in fact is a problem or someone's trying to test those controls or find a way around those controls. So we look at that from that perspective. And we take it a step further. Lots of information on this slide, but the real point here is that we want to take it beyond just the EDI and just beyond the electronic discussions and really into a programmatic program of defense. And we call that in our cyber resiliency. And so how do we move from a reactive organization, reactive to our supply chain, and we're taking information as it's coming to us from our vendors and our trading partners, and we're moving that into more of a proactive cyber resilient supply chain. So I think we've all done vendor risk assessments, and that usually is in the form of actually sending out a questionnaire, asking them to answer a few questions. They send that back and we give them a risk score. These are good. They're still a valid way to quantify the risk that you have within your supply chain, but they need to be done on a regular basis. So you need to regularly evaluate those and monitor those, making sure that you're getting those updated regularly. If there is a change in the security posture, we need to make sure that we're updating our risk register and making sure that we're updating our risk exposure, depending on how that security posture has changed. And then we need to look at finding ways to proactively identify risks before they impact the operations. So not just sending a questionnaire, but actually having conversations with those key trading partners to understand how they're managing their overall environment, and then working that into our overall programmatic program around cyber resiliency. Then we talk about when we talk about cyber resiliency, we can't do it without talking about the response and recovery. So incident response planning is a big part of cyber resiliency, and one that we preach a lot to our clients and helping them understand that it's good to have identity protection and detection and detecting something, but you need to have a response plan in place, and it needs to be tested regularly. So developing, testing, coordinating those responses with the teams that are actually going to be responsible for leading those response programs, as well as when that event happens, ensuring that you have coverage to do that. And that also allows you to have those conversations with your vendors to ensure that they are coordinated with your response plans. So if they have a problem on their end, then there needs to be a notification back to you in a certain period of time. And those responses need to be coordinated with your vendors as well as your own internal teams. So it's a joint incident response playbooks, making sure that you're working together on those. Oftentimes we encourage clients to make sure that they're doing joint tabletop exercises with their trading partners to ensure that if there is events happening on a trading vendor or a partner, that the organization is getting notification and that they understand the communication protocols and how that needs to be communicated. And then what is the escalation plan for activities that happen within the organization. So if something gets deemed level 1 threat intelligence, or if it gets to be an event, then how do we escalate that? Who needs to be notified within the organization? And then what are the next steps to start the mitigation of that? Then we move to the network segmentation. This becomes a big thing within our OT environments, and particularly EDI as well. So having a way to isolate EDI and the supply chain systems within a segmented network zone is a best practices recommendation that we recommend clients look at security zones and conduits, so those communications are monitored regularly, but then allowing you to segment or even micro segment an EDI or supply chain systems off of your main networks, or at least in a segmented safety zone or security zone that would allow you to monitor that traffic in and out of that particular network. And then if it is compromised, it allows you to isolate that segment and limits the lateral movement of the threat and reduces that exposure of the breach itself. So a lot of times this requires a review of the network analysis or network traffic, and then designing and developing a network segmentation strategy around that and how you would handle that. And that plays into your response planning as well. And then we talk about integrating the EDI gateways. We talked about that before in terms of the overall management of your EDI and how do you bring that into the overall security practice. A lot of times in the past, these were unmonitored gateways. We now are encouraging clients to find ways to integrate those gateways into or integrating the logs from those gateways into your overall SIEM, as well as your SOC operations, your security operations center. So making sure that you're continuously monitoring those, you're getting the alerts, and you're doing the forensic analysis on those as well. And then we take it a step further and encourage threat hunting within your environments as well. So ensuring that you are taking known exploits, going out there with your SOC analyst and doing threat hunting within your environment to ensure that you don't have a vulnerability that can be exploited in your environment. And then finally, this fifth box is one that we're starting to see more and more of, and that is really embedding that security requirement into your vendor contracts and service level agreements. So when we talk about trying to have that full transparency for our trading partners into what their risks and how their risk actually impact us and cause us to have risk on our supply chain, we need to have some teeth in terms of how that information is being shared with us, and then what requirements they are going to have to provide information to us to ensure that we can effectively manage that supply chain risk and that interconnectivity between the different organizations. So embedding that cybersecurity requirement into vendor contracts and service level agreements is something that we're starting to see more and more of. And then also leveraging cyber insurance to manage financial risks from supply chain breaches. This obviously is a growing area. Organizations are taking on more and more supply chain cyber risk, and they're starting to look for ways to divert that potential breach and or financial risk that they have. So cyber insurance policies are extending out into third-party risk, which will incorporate, we are anticipating incorporating into additional regulations as well as contractual requirements, because the insurance companies will start to require it if they're going to be exposed to a potential breach or risk and trying to have to cover those risks as well. So as a whole, we literally look at this from all the way from vendor risk management and assessments all the way through to contracting and insurance requirements as you work through those. And in the middle, you're really looking at your incident response planning, your network segmentation in case you have a breach, so you know how you're going to respond, how do you isolate that, and then how are you constantly monitoring so that you can act appropriately in real time to the events as they're happening. So looking at moving from reactive to resilient, we talk about this a lot with clients in terms of really understanding that collaborative partnership with your supply chain. This is not a situation where you sign a contract with someone, send them a questionnaire, they fill out the questionnaire, you get the questionnaire back, you send it to your risk management group. The risk management group reviews it, applies a risk score to that vendor, and that goes into a file. And you may look at it again in a year from now as a compliance requirement, but you're not really interacting and discussing these risks regularly and building trust with your trading partners. This collaborative partnership is one that takes a lot of work. It is something that you have to constantly work with your partners, building that resiliency. It requires a partnership working together over a shared digital environment. So you have to understand the risks that each of you pose to each system. So not only does your trading partner pose a risk to you, but vice versa. And so it is advantageous to both parties to share as much information and have visibility within and/or response within their own environment, but also in their trading partner's environment within the supply chain. So to have a true cyber resilient supply chain, it requires this collaborative partnership. Some of the key resiliency pillars that we see, I've mentioned a few here, but just wanted to again address it. Implementing zero trust. A lot of clients view this as a be all end all. You have to do zero trust on everything. What we find is a lot of times they start with an initiative to implement zero trust. They get about 50 to 65% with all of their applications and processes, and then they run into a problem where it may be a legacy system or something else that they can't apply zero trust to, or they can't apply it to a vendor's environment or a vendor's connection because of contractual requirements where a vendor has to actually have access to the client environment contractually, and they put it in there to be able to meet their SLAs. So there becomes a hindrance to actually deploying zero trust. I think the caveat here is, yes, zero trust would be a great way for us to protect it, but don't let it stop you from putting in strong IAM practices. So identity and access management practices around zero trust. If you're unable to get it on 100% of your environment, 65 is better than zero. And we want to continue to preach that with supplier access, particularly if you can get 100% of zero trust on the supplier access to your environments is the gold standard of where we want to be there. We want to make sure that we're enabling continuous monitoring. So making sure that you've got that control monitoring in place around your EDI gateways as well. And then we want to foster that shared accountability with security across all partners. So that includes our both internal teams as well as our third-party external vendors as well. So let's boil it down to 3 key points. I know we've talked a lot around the overall supply chain as a whole. We've talked about some individual hardening of the EDI. Then we've also talked about our risks that are associated with our third-party vendor connections through our EDI. We've talked about the cyber resiliency of what we're trying to accomplish there as well. But looking at, and then we've looked at our cyber resiliency as a programmatic program. But the 3 key takeaways that I would like everyone to take from the webinar today is really around 1, your attack surface, recognizing that your supply chain expands your cybersecurity perimeter, which there in turns increases your overall attack surface and increases your potential for being a target. So you need to be vigilant about risk management and how you're handling your overall cybersecurity as it relates to your supply chain and your EDI. We talk about modernizing your EDI. This doesn't have to mean that you have to go out and buy a new EDI with millions of dollars worth of licensing. It's really talking about understanding what system you have, whether or not it's supported, whether or not there is an updated version of your EDI system, and whether or not you can go out there and patch or increase that support. But then it also means that implementing strong identity and access management. Again, we've moved the perimeter back to identities now. So we've moved away from perimeter defenses, and we've really driven this down to the identity level. So we want to continue to put those strong identity and access management rules and regulations in place in our organizations so that we can protect our EDI. And then continuous monitoring. So making sure that we're closing those security gaps by continuously monitoring our EDI gateways, pulling those logs into our overall SOC operations, and allowing our SOC engineers and SOC analysts to review that traffic and get alerts and be able to respond to those in a timely manner. And then cybersecurity is in supply chains, particularly, is a shared responsibility. So no company can do it alone, and no company can go it alone because they have responsibilities for either their trading partners or they have outsourced vendors that help them with their security and in their supply chains. So ask for help. It is a shared responsibility. It's one that we're all in this together to make sure that we can really protect the overall supply chain from a security attack. So what's your next move? So wanted to make sure that we gave you some takeaways from the webinar in terms of what you could do quickly and take this and implement it in your organizations. Again, we go back to you can't protect what you don't know you don't have in terms of a risk. So mapping your vendors and EDI dependencies to really understand which vendor and which dependency is at the highest risk, and then focusing our efforts on protecting and hardening that connection in that area. So getting a full visibility of your supply chain and the connections and the potential risk points are really important. So looking at that asset and vulnerability management is your next step to make sure that you have a full visibility. You want to make sure that you're enabling continuous monitoring. I keep preaching this over and over, but it is important that we're doing that. We're alerting on those detections. We're getting to them quickly. Again, we're not talking about if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And so when it happens, that you get someone who is trying to breach your system, you want to be able to react to that in a timely manner in real time. The only way to do that is to be in a continuous monitoring situation where you're constantly monitoring these. You need to be detecting those anomalies and responding quickly. Third, we want to develop and test a coordinated response and recovery plan. It's not just good enough to have a response and recovery plan, but have we tested it? And have we tested it with our trading partners? So have we invited our trading partners to those tabletop exercises that we do on an annual basis? And are we having open and collaborative conversations around how we're going to handle certain situations or certain cyber breaches or scenarios, or even active threat scenarios? So if we're in an active threat scenario, how are we going to communicate and inform our trading partners, and vice versa? How would they inform us in the case that they may be in an active threat environment, in active threat mode? So how do we do that? We do that by regularly testing and then having that open and communication, and to be able to make sure that we're communicating across our supply chain about those incidents. And then finally, we look at embedding security requirements into contracts and government frameworks or governance frameworks. So not only having in place a vendor risk program and policy, but how are we going to incorporate those security requirements into our contracts with our trading partners, and making sure that we're really putting it into our internal governance frameworks as well. So not just sending a questionnaire, getting a response, and then putting it into a file, but how are we going to regularly go in and check to see that our trading partners are doing their own due diligence and using their own best practices to ensure that their supply chain is secure or their environment is secure, so that they're not a risk or security risk to us. So these are just some high-level takeaways that you can continue to work on, and I think it would help increase and strengthen the supply chain as a whole. These are activities that we often see with a lot of clients that are looking to continue to build their cyber resiliency within supply chains, but they're also looking for help in terms of how do they manage this overall supply chain risk. And so these are activities that we see a lot of clients successful in doing this and as they work through this with their trading partners. So with that, I wanted to do a quick overview of who we are and some of the things that we work on. So as a whole, we are an IT consulting agency. CTG is a CHECA company, and we are headquartered out of Belgium. We have headquarters here in the US as well, and we work across all states in North America, as well as some nearshoring in Colombia. We have operations in Canada as well. We have a lot of operations in supply chain. We do a lot of work in supply chain around applications and around data and AI, and then also around OT with a lot of the OT warehousing and optimization planning. From a cybersecurity perspective, we do a lot of work on assessments. So being able to come in and, as we mentioned, mapping out your vendors and vendor risks. We do assessments around overall security maturity, as well as any of your risk assessments that are related to your cyber security risks. We have a continuous security advisory framework, and we also have what we call the SEC and CTG security assessment framework that we use to assess organizations across the different industries that we work in, and particularly supply chain, and working with supply chain companies to do that. We have security operations centers in Romania. We have one in Belgium, as well as one in New York. We have one in our headquarters in Buffalo, New York, here in the US. We do have services for CISO Office as a Service, which is a continuous advisory framework that we work with clients on. And then we have a large identity and access management practice as well that we help clients with their identity and access management practices. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming to the webinar, and I hope that this has been a valuable discussion around supply chain and cybersecurity risks.
Thanks so much, Chad. If you would, we do have a few questions from the audience. There was a lot of information there to digest, but here's a question. Security measures sometimes get a bad reputation for slowing down operations. How can organizations strengthen supply chain security without adding friction to the business?
Yeah, it's an age-old argument and a great question because we see that a lot, particularly when we get into identity and access management, because everyone wants to have access to systems and they want to be able to go and do the work and be able to have the tool they need to get that work done. What we see a lot of times in past, we've had this layer of protection strategy. So companies in the beginning of cybersecurity, when it became, a household name, were buying applications like they were on fire sale. So we were buying layer application over application over application, and we had these overlapping responsibilities and overlapping duties that a particular security application or control was responsible for and taken care of, which caused a lot of friction because oftentimes we were having to go through multiple steps to get access or do things. What we've seen lately is that organizations are starting to look at a cybersecurity risk as not an application risk, but it really is an enterprise risk management program. So being able to communicate that risk back to your leadership is really important so that you can quantify the potential cybersecurity risk and that turn supply chain risk in terms of a business continuity risk, and then that will justify the actual control that you put in place, and then it takes that collaborative communication to ensure that people understand why we're doing what we're doing and why it's important that we go through these processes to have multi-factor authentication, or we have to force encrypted communications. These are all practices, they do cause friction and they do at times slow down the overall process. But in a situation like we have in current standards where everyone is a target, we have to be a little more vigilant. And so that works through making sure that we're communicating that risk effectively within the organization.
That makes a lot of sense. Here's another question. What's the one emerging cybersecurity threat you're most concerned about right now, if you had to choose one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit trite at this point, but it's AI. We talk about it a lot. AI is, yes, we're using it in cybersecurity as well, and on the defensive side, but it's being used on the offensive side as well, and it's being used very effectively. And they're being used in ways that we're not necessarily thinking about because they haven't been used in the past, right? And so we're starting to see a lot of these automated attacks. We are also seeing ways that identity spoofing is becoming very sophisticated. It becomes another tool for the bad actors to use to their advantage. And while in the beginning of early stage generative AI, everybody was concerned about jailbreaking a model to be able to run some exploits and be able to get that exploit directly from a generative AI. Now we're moving into agentic AI where the actual machines act on their own. And so you're able to program it in a way so that they are actually running those exploits in times 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they don't sleep. And so that becomes a real big emerging problem. I think the other issue that in particularly is going to be a problem for EDI in the supply chain because of the communication protocols is going to be when we get into a situation when our computing gets so strong that encryption is just going to be broken with the easiest of efforts. So encryption standards are going to be a problem when we get into that new computing stage, which is coming out. And so those encryption standards are going to be broken, and we've got to come up with a new way to be able to encrypt those protocols. But today, until that happens, we need to make sure that we've got good, strong encryption standards in place. We see a lot of times where organizations aren't even looking at their encryption standards or even what encryption standards they're using or communication protocols they're using. So you need to make sure that we're looking at those regularly and evaluating whether or not they can be breached and broken. So yeah, that's between AI and between computing power increasing constantly to break encryption standards. Those are the two biggest ones that I think would keep us up at night.
Got it. All right. Well, we have one last question. As more companies move from traditional EDI bans to API-driven ecosystems, how is the security risk changing, if it's changing?
Yeah, I mean, it will change because you can see all the same API attacks that you see for applications will still be valid and relevant for EDI. And that communication, while there are some pros, there are still some cons as well. So when you're looking at your API, if you're moving to an API connection and moving away from EDI connections, you need to ensure that you're testing that API connection regularly and making sure that any updates and upgrades that need to be made or changes to secure that API connection is done on a regular basis. Oftentimes, we're getting an API from a vendor, and so we need to make sure that that vendor is testing those APIs, or we're doing the testing on those APIs to see what we can uncover in terms of vulnerability. But that's where that collaboration comes in place again. It's even more important on an API connection situation where you're got those connections in place that you're maybe having to take from a vendor. You need to make sure that you're testing those regularly, or at least the vendor's testing them on a regular basis.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Chad, for sharing some great tips with us. And to everyone on the call, do reach out to Chad and his team to go deeper into this topic and see how they may be able to help you. But right now, check out the link in the chat, and you'll see that we're bringing back an industry favorite for our next webinar on October 22nd. RVCF's Paula Giovanetti will be sharing her extensive expertise once again, this time to help you successfully deploy any emerging technology you may be contemplating right now. So you'll find more details on that registration link, and we'll also share that link in the email that you'll be receiving in the next couple of days, of course, with the on-demand recording of this session. So we appreciate you joining us and would love to see you again for future installments of ECGrid Presents. If you have any questions at all for the ECGrid team, just reach out anytime, info@ecgrid.com. Thank you again, Chad. And that's it for now. Wish you all a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.